Hey everybody, Matt Christian here. This discussion will be discussing the eternal society paradox. Alright, can you see it?
Yep.
Alright. Eternal society paradox. So, the eternal society paradox is one in which an eternal society with the abilities of ordinary human beings in each year of existence uses its modest abilities to create a logical contradiction. So this paradox can in turn be used to argue against an infinite past, and the possibility of an infinite past can be used to support first cause arguments. The idea is that if the physical universe began to exist, it would require some type of cause transcending space and time if time itself had a beginning and the past is finite. For our purposes, we'll just focus on the argument against an infinite past. So the eternal society, as I mentioned before, is the one that exists in each year throughout the infinite beginningless pasts. And it has the abilities of ordinary human beings in each year of its existence. For example, in each year they could flip coins and make decisions based on coin flip results. Now, because of the society's extremely modest abilities, it seems like an eternal society would be possible if an infinite past were possible. So this eternal society has a certain tradition. Each year they flip a coin. If the coin comes up heads and they never did a particular chant before, then they do the chant. Otherwise, they do not do the chant for that year. So, very simple. That's just the tradition in itself. Very simple. So one possible outcome for this tradition, at least if the annual coin flipping tradition were possible, is that the coin came up heads for the first time last year, and the result would be that the Eternal Society did the chant last year, because it came up heads for the first time last year, and again, the rule is, if it comes up heads, they do the chant, though only if they never did it before. A second scenario, which we can call scenario S2, is that the coin came up heads each year. Now, if the coin came up heads each year, did they ever do the chant? Well, they had to have done the chant because the coin came up heads last year, and they would have done it then if they hadn't done it before. But they also couldn't have done the chant in any year, because any year you point to, there's a prior year where they would have done the chant if they didn't do it before. And the result is a contradiction. That second scenario, scenario S2, is logically impossible. So this kind of brings us to an argument against an infinite past. The overview basically kind of goes like this, that if an infinite past were possible, well then the Eternal Society would be possible, and then the Eternal Society could have done the annual coin flipping tradition. Then scenario S1, heads for the first time last year, could have happened, and then scenario S2, heads each year, could have happened, and that leads to an impossibility. So, deductively it goes like this. If an infinite past is possible, an Eternal Society is possible, the possibility being a metaphysical possibility. If the Eternal Society is possible, they could have done the annual coin flip tradition. If they could have done the annual coin flipping tradition, then the first scenario, S1, is possible. If the first scenario, S1, is possible, then the second scenario, S2, is possible. The second scenario, S2, is not possible. Therefore, an infinite past is possible. It's not possible. So the justification for 2 is that, by definition, the Eternal Society has the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of existence, and thus in each year they could flip coins, make decisions based on coin flip results, etc. So if the Eternal Society is possible, they could have done that tradition. What about the tradition? What about 3? Well, coin flips are probabilistically independent events, so coin coming up heads each year for the first time last year is a possible outcome. For 4, the coin flips, again, are probabilistically independent events, so if S1 could have happened, then so could S2. S2 being, again, that the coin came up heads each year. And note that in both S1 and S2, the dispositions of what will occur given the outcome of random experiment are the same. So it doesn't make sense to say that S1 is possible, but S2 is not possible. And justification for 5, kind of already mentioned, the Eternal Society had done the chant. The coin came up heads last year. If they could not have done the chant, there is no year they could have done it. Each year has a prior year where the coin came up heads. And the logical contradiction makes S2 logically impossible. So this argument is logically valid. Valid just means it's impossible to have two premises and a false conclusion. And soundness is a valid argument with all two premises. Now, since the argument is logically valid, if it's unsound, which premise is false? Where does the chain of possibility break? And this is the chain of possibility. If an infinite past were possible, then Eternal Society would be possible. The Eternal Society could have done the annual coin flip tradition, and so forth. If the Eternal Society argument isn't sound, where's the broken link in this chain? Now here's how I would attack this argument. It's the best one I can think of. If I wanted to believe in infinite past, I'd just deny premise 1. Say that an infinite past is possible, the Eternal Society isn't. Now the problem with this is that, as the original paper says, Surely there is something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past of an eternal society. The abilities of ordinary humans can actualize a logical contradiction. It just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that should be possible if an infinite past were possible. And so that is it in a nutshell.
Okay. And I want to have this conversation. Like, I'll address the arguments like right up front, and then I want to dive a little bit into epistemology because I think it's very interesting there. So let me just like address the argument. I think I have issues with premise 3 and premise 4. So let me go into that. The issues that I would have with premise 3, saying that if S1 is possible, then S2 would be possible, is as follows. I can see certain ways. Here, let me word it this way. If you can show that a certain way that an infinite regress is impossible, that doesn't mean always all are impossible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but then we're going to have to, of course, deal with a specific premise.
Well, that would be me addressing the third premise, if that's what that means. I don't know if it exactly means that, right? Like, is S1 or is S2 possible? S1 is possible. S2, and here, let me address another premise. Premise 4, S2 is not possible. Actually, S2 is possible. It's just not possible with the eternal society. So it's an incompatible pair.
The definition of scenario S2 is that it's an eternal society that has actually done this tradition for an infinite past.
Under
That's the
that
definition of the second scenario.
Right. If you mix premise, what is that? If you mix premise 4, so if S2, so if scenario 2 is mixed with the eternal society paradox, then yeah, that's a contradiction. I do agree with that. That is impossible. But like I was saying, you can imagine certain ways that an infinite regress could be impossible. That doesn't mean always are impossible. Do you know what I'm saying now?
I sort of disagree because I think like an infinite causal regress, or an infinite past is impossible. So I think it's all impossible. It's just a matter of how you get there.
Well, you said it's all impossible. How is S1 impossible? I mean, your argument even says it's possible.
No, I didn't say S1 is possible. I said S1 is possible if the annual coin flipping tradition is possible. So if the Eternal Society could do the annual coin flip tradition, then the outcome of S1 is possible. Now, why do I think the S1 is possible? Well, perhaps this illustration will help. Suppose that in this scenario, there's a button that, if it's pressed, it creates a married bachelor. Now, if somebody flips a coin, if it comes up heads, then the button is pushed and a married bachelor is created. If it comes up tails, then the button isn't pressed. Now, suppose in one scenario, the coin comes up tails and the button isn't pressed. Is this scenario possible? Well, it's not possible because it implies the possibility of the coin possibly coming up heads and creating a married bachelor. And because the dispositions of what will occur given the outcome of a random experiment are the same in both cases, the scenario in which the coin comes up heads and the button isn't pushed, well, that's impossible because it implies the possibility of a logical contradiction. And that holds the same here. I mean, if the coin could have come up heads for the first time last year, it could have come up heads every year because the coin flips are probabilistically independent events.
Right, but I could give you scenarios where there is no contradiction. For example, it could be tails, like all the way to infinity on the left hand side, right? And then we get like a head for the first time, and then we keep getting tails. Once in a while, we get heads, and then tails for infinity on the right hand side. In this scenario, it's totally compatible, right? So in some ways, you can make a contradiction appear, but that doesn't mean it appears in all ways. I don't know if I'm making sense. Did that make sense to you?
No, I'm not really confused. So do you agree that the scenario S1 implies the possibility of S2?
Well, that depends what we're saying there.
Okay, given the circumstances of conditions mentioned in S1, if S1 is possible, does that imply that the coin could have come up heads each year of the infinite past because the coin flips are probabilistically independent events?
No.
Well, the coin flips. The coin flips, by definition, are probabilistically independent events. So, I mean, given the condition of the scenario, what's to stop the coins from coming up heads each year?
Here, let me go, because there were some objections that you mentioned in your video, but I do think they work. Because I think right now you're doing the, I know you didn't like it, but it was like the, hold on, let me see. Let me go into my notes real quick. Here, can I quickly, here, let me try to find that specific one. Because I had, let me see.
Because it seems to be built into the definition of the scenario. Just like in the married bachelor scenario where the coin comes up heads, it could have come up tails. That's built into the scenario. Similarly, because the coin flips are probabilistically independent events, the fact that the coin could have come up heads each year, that's built into the definition of scenario S1. Yeah, because the coin flips are probabilistically independent events. There's nothing to prevent it from coming up heads each year.
I'm trying to find my notes for that specifically. Okay, so for the Eternal Society, the rules for them to do the cheer is that one, there's heads, the coin comes up heads, and the second rule is that it comes heads for the first time. That's the condition, right? You're
Actually, the condition more specifically is if the coin comes up heads, they do the chant, but only if they did not do the chant in a prior year. That's the more precise definition of the tradition.
Right. Right. And I think somebody told you this objection, like the first and last fallacy. If we have an infinite regress, there is no beginning, right? If it's heads every single time, and you're like, well, what's the first head? There is no first head. So in this case, there would not be a first cheer, right? So what you could say, chant. Right, there would be no first chant. So what you could say is that it's an incompatible pair. You cannot have an infinite regress and Eternal Society. But all that means is that when you combine both of them, there's a contradiction. That's all it's saying. And you can modify you can modify the situation for there to be no contradiction. Like I was telling you, it could be that you get tails as an infinite regress, right? So just imagine infinity all the way to the left-hand side, like on a graph, right? And then, you get the first head, and that's when they do the chant, right? And then it goes on tails, all the way to infinity, all the way to the right. If something like that happened, there is no problem. Under some conditions, there is a problem, though.
Okay, so by the first and last fallacy, do you mean that a person envisions a supposedly infinite series as having both a first and last element? Is that what you mean by that?
Well, in S2, right, it's just heads, right? They flip a coin and they just get heads every single time, and it's always been like that. So when did they flip heads first? And there is no first head.
That's the part of the definition of the scenario, is that there is no first year in which the coin flipped up heads. That's why there's a contradiction.
Right. There is no first head because it's an infinite regress. So asking for a first head seems a little bit weird. And it's only weird if you combine it with the Eternal Society.
Yes, that's true. But again, it does seem that S1 implies the possibility of S2. Because the coin flips, again, are probabilistically independent events. So if it could come up heads for the first time last year, then it could have come up heads each year, right?
Sorry, repeat that again?
So the coin flips are probabilistically independent events for each year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the coin could have come up heads last year, then the coin could have come up heads each year of the infinite past, right?
Right. But this is an issue with the Eternal Society. It's only an issue with that. Because when you're talking about... Sorry, just real quick. When we're talking about like possibility, right? I talk about logical possibility and then physical possibility. Logical possibility is just, if it's consistent, then it's possible. That's all it is, right? Physically possible means reality actually allows for it. So it's more than just consistency. And for you to know this, you need to at least have experienced it one time. And then you know it's physically possible. There's a lot of things that are consistent, but they're not physically possible. They just do not happen in reality at all. They have like a zero probability in reality. With coins, right, we know that this possibility, right? But if you're trying to make it analogous to our universe, that's kind of difficult because we know the possibility of a coin flip. We don't know the possibility of our conditions. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So if you agree that the coin, if in scenario S1, the coin could have come up heads for the first time last year, if that scenario S1 implies the possibility of S2, where the coin coming up heads each year, then it seems like you're not really disagreeing with that fourth premise. Is there a premise that you disagree with?
No. Clear. Let me look at my notes real quick. So hold on. S2 itself. Okay, hold on. It's already mentioned that point. Okay. I'm saying that it is possible that the Eternal Society and the rules that you set up, they could work, but in some conditions they could not work. I agree with that. Okay. What am I trying to say? I forgot.
So I asked you which premise you disagree with. So to recap, the first premise says if an infinite past is possible, the Eternal Society is possible. Mm-hmm. The second premise says that if Eternal Society is possible, then they could have done the annual coin flip tradition. The third premise says that they could have done the annual coin flipping tradition, and then scenario S1 is possible. The coin came up heads for the first time last year. The fourth premise says that if scenario S1 is possible, coin came up heads last year, then the second scenario is possible, where the coin came up heads each year. Is there any of those premises you disagree with?
And by the way, I'm using the argument that you sent me, so it's version 17. So I don't know if we're looking at the same one, but premise 3, I disagree with that one. S1 could it be possible? That doesn't mean that S2 is possible.
What about the version I showed? So what is in your version? What is that premise?
If S1 were possible, then S2 would be possible.
Okay, so that's premise 4 in the presentation I gave.
Oh, that's where we're all confused. Okay.
Okay, yeah. So if S1 is possible and S2 is possible, but didn't you concede a moment ago that if the coin could have come up heads for the first time last year, the coin could have come up heads each year of the infinite past?
That's true, but we're talking about. So remember how I said? Now, I'll come back. I promise, but it's relevant. So premise 4 in the argument that you sent me is S2 is not possible. Actually, S2 is possible. That's totally possible. It's just not possible when you combine it with the Eternal Society. So
the definition of scenario S2 is an eternal society. It has coin heads each year of the infinite past.
Well, right. When it comes to the Eternal Society, S2 is totally possible.
That when it comes to Eternal Society, S2 is possible?
Yeah, but
doesn't that scenario generate a logical contradiction?
Right, and then that would invalidate it.
Yeah, it'd be logically impossible. So scenario S2 is logically impossible, right?
Right, but S1 would be possible while S2 is not, correct?
Well, I don't think S1 is possible, precisely because it implies the possibility of S2. So if S1 is possible, then S2 is possible. But S2 is not possible, from which would follow that S1 is also not possible. But I do think S1 would be possible if an eternal society were possible.
Well, here's the thing: if an eternal society is possible, S1 is possible, but S2 is not possible, right? And here's what I was saying before: you can prove something is not possible in one way, but that doesn't mean it's impossible in all ways. So that's my issue with the argument.
Well, for the argument to be sound, there needs to be a false premise. So is there a premise you disagree
3 and
with?
4. 3 and 4 from the version you gave me. So if S1 is possible, then S2 is possible.
Okay,
I would say
so
I don't see how that follows. It could be possible in one way, but not possible in another way.
okay, so you're disputing the idea that if S1 is possible, then S2 is possible. Am I right so far?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in S1, the coin came up heads each year. With me so far?
Yep.
Okay. Now, if the coin could have come up heads for the first time last year, due to the conditions defined in the scenario, wouldn't have also been possible for the coin to come up heads each year of the infinite past because the coin flips are
You muted yourself.
probabilistically independent events.
No, I'm saying like when it comes to the Eternal Society as a whole, Eternal Society, right? This society that does this tradition, both of these are possible, except when you look at the details. And then when you look at the details, you see that S2 is actually not possible, but S1 is possible. That's what I'm saying. So when you look at the whole society, right, the Eternal Society, S1 is possible. S2 seems possible, but then you think about it and you're like, it's been heads for eternity. There is no first head. Therefore, they could never do the chant, right? Because the conditions requires a head and a head for the first time. But there is no first time. So, I'm sorry, rambling. Based on the rules you set, S1 is possible, S2 is not. So just because S1 is possible, I don't see how that follows that therefore S2 is possible. I just don't see that.
Okay, so I'm afraid you didn't quite answer the question I asked. So in S1, the coin came up heads for the first time. You with me so far?
Yep.
Okay. Now, if the coin could have come up, because the coin flips are probabilistically independent events, would it have also been possible for the coin flip to come up heads each year of the infinite past?
Yeah.
And that's S2. So that's why S1 implies the possibility of S2. Think of the married bachelor button scenario. If it comes up heads, a married bachelor is created. If it comes up tails, a married bachelor is not created. Now, the scenario in which the coin comes up tails is not possible because that implies the possibility of the coin coming up heads. That's just built into the scenario, that possibility. So that same principle holds true here. The coin flips, given this condition of the scenario, could have come up, heads for the first time last year, or could have come up tails. Or could have come up heads for the first time last year, could have come up heads each year of the infinite past. That possible outcome is built in to scenario S1. Because I said the coin flips are probabilistically independent events. So if the coin flip could have come in scenario S1, would it have been possible for the coin flip to come up heads each year of the infinite past?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying now. Well, actually, no, because in S1, there's a first head, right?
Yeah.
And in S2, there is no first head. So
That's
S1
true.
S1 does actually not imply S2. They're actually contradictory.
Okay, so think about it. If the coin came up heads for the first time last year, could the coin have come up heads each year of the infinite past?
No. And not...
By definition, the coin flips are probabilistically independent events. I mean,
Well, you're saying the first head, right? You're saying,
No. I'm not saying the first heads. I'm saying, would it have been possible for the coin if the coin came up heads for the first time last year, would it have also been possible for the coin flip to come up heads each year of the infinite past?
I don't see what you're saying. So, like in S1, there's a head that came up for the first time, and then they do the cheer. In S2, it's always been head. So it's not a first head. These are not... You cannot have S1 and S2. They're not compatible either.
Okay, so could the coin, again, if the coin came up heads for the first time last year, would it have also been possible for the coin to come up heads each year of the infinite past?
No, because there would be no first head. So are you asking me if there's a first head, but then if there's prior heads?
No, I'm not asking that. I'm just saying it would have been possible for the coin flip to come up heads each year of the infinite past.
That is possible. Well, sorry. That would be possible, except that you're saying that it's already built into the infinite. Sorry, it's already built into the Eternal Society. So then, no, it's not. That's not possible. S2 is not possible.
I know S2 is not possible.
Uh-huh.
But I'm saying, let's go back to the simpler problem. Now, imagine this scenario, the definition of this scenario, the married bachelor scenario, where if the coin come up heads, a button is pushed and a married bachelor is created. But if the coin comes up tails, the button isn't pushed and no married bachelor is created. Now, think of where the coin came up heads, came up tails, married bachelor scenario. Does that scenario imply the possibility of the coin coming up heads?
Repeat the last part again.
Okay. In this scenario in which the coin came up heads, again, this is a married bachelor button scenario. Does this scenario also imply the possibility that a married bachelor could have been created?
Well, it depends what possible. In this thought experiment, it would be possible, but I mean, in reality, no.
That's what I'm saying. So that if S1 is possible, because remember, the only difference between the two is the outcome of a random experiment. The predispositions of what will occur given the outcome of a random experiment are the same in both S1 and S2.
Well, here's the thing. So S2 is proven incorrect based on the rules that you set in this thought experiment. S1 is not proven incorrect. So I'm asking you, how can you prove S1 is incorrect?
Because
and you're trying to
the possibility of S2. If the coin could have come up heads, again, the coin flips are probabilistically independent events. So let's just abstract this in general. Suppose Eternal Society, all they did was flip a coin each year.
Yep.
And as the coin came up heads for the first time last year, possible outcome.
I'm sorry. So sorry. Spaced out for a little bit. You said if what?
I suppose all the Eternal Society did was flip a coin each year. And the coin flips, again, are probabilistically independent events.
Right.
Is the coin coming up heads for the first time last year possible in this scenario?
Yeah, it's possible that they get a first head, right? They get tails, head, first head. That's possible.
So, given the definition of this scenario, wouldn't it have also been possible the coin came up heads every year?
Correct. That's also possible. That just head for eternity.
The coin flips are probabilistically independent events. So the sample space, the possible outcome, is basically any combination of heads or tails.
Mm-hmm.
Scenario S1, that possibility space of the coin flips is built into the scenario. By definition, the coin flips are probabilistically independent events.
Yep.
So all possible coin flip outcomes, that possibility is built into scenario S1. Are you with me so far?
So all of this is in S1, right?
Yes. The coin flips are probabilistically independent events.
But
so any basically heads tails combination is part of the possibility space. But the coin flips are probabilistically independent events. Just like in the married bachelor button scenario, both heads and tails, both possibilities are built into the definition of the scenario.
Hey, I'm not really super educated on philosophy, but one question: are you using the principle of explosion or something like that right now?
No, I'm not.
Because it's like in S1 we have this Eternal Society with the rules you said. They flip a coin. They'll either get heads or tails. If they get a first head, right, then they'll do a chant. In S1 they do get a first head, so it's totally fine. In S2 it's like the same rules, but they always flip a head. So they'll just never do a chant. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, what would be contradictory? So I'm so sorry. I'm kind of derailing here. I hope you don't mind. Because I'm actually trying to learn. I'm trying to learn right now. In S2, what's wrong again? Because I think it's only wrong if you assume there will be a chant. But if there's no chant, what is wrong?
Okay. Suppose you say, well, they never did the chant. They had to have done the chant that last year, some year, because if it came up heads, they would have done the chant then if they had never done it before. Because the rule is, we do if it comes up heads, we do the chant, but only if we never did the chant in a prior year.
No. If it's all heads, there is no first head, so they would have never done the chant.
There is no first year. Yes, if it's
but why would you?
They never did the chant, but they also had to have done the chant.
Why?
Because if it came up heads, think of last year. The coin came up heads. By definition, they do the chant then if they had not done it before.
Oh, but let me go back to the rules. It's not just head. The coin needs to come up heads, and there needs to have been a first head. So I think you're not being consistent with your own rules. No, that's not
the definition of the scenario. The definition of the scenario is that if the coin comes up heads, they do the chant, but only if they never did the chant in a prior year. That is the definition.
Right. So if it's always been if it's always been heads, um, they got ahead, so they met that condition.
Hmm.
But they also have done heads before,
Yes.
so they would have not done the chant. I don't see what's the problem there.
They could not have done the chant, and yet by the rules of the tradition, they had to have done the chant. Because think of last year. If they had done the chant, then last year they would have done the chant had they not done the chant before. Because the rule is, if it comes up heads, then we do the chant. If we never did the chant before, are you with me so far?
Yeah, but it's been heads, 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 heads. It's
Yeah.
always been it's always been heads before. Based on that rules, they would have not said, okay, let's do the chant. They would have not done the chant.
They would not have done the chant, and yet by the rules, they had to have done the chant, right?
Let me think about this a little more. And by the way, I'm doing this like on lifetime.
Okay, yeah. But think about
So-
think about it one thing at a time. So you agree that they couldn't have done the chant, right?
So there's two conditions for them to do the chant. So first condition is the coin needs to be a heads. Second condition is, say it one more time.
They had done the chant in a prior year.
Haven't done chant in a prior year.
Yes.
Haven't done chant in prior year, but they do the chant if there's a first head. Is that not true?
It implies that, but it's important to remember the exact definition of this scenario, of the tradition. Tradition is, if it comes up heads, then they do the chant, but only if they had not done the chant in a prior year. That is the definition of it.
Right.
So
So
they go through this two-step process. Okay, it came up heads. Okay.
Yep.
Now, have we done the chant in a prior year? If we have done the chant in a prior year, then we don't do the chant. But if we have not done the chant in a prior year and it came up heads, then we do the chant.
Right. I think I see the problem, or maybe I'm just confused. So let me tell you what I'm thinking. So, and by the way, I'm totally open to like being wrong. I actually, now I'm actually doubting S2 because I think based on the rules, there would be no paradox. So one rule is that there needs to be a head. The coin needs to come up head. And then the second rule that you said is that if they haven't done the chant before, then they'll do the chant now, right? So that is actually telling me that there needs to be a first head. That's what it's telling me. Because if it's not just if it's a head, right? It's if it's a head and they haven't done it before. So when do they do the chant? It's when they get ahead. And if they haven't done it before, that means a first head. Does it not?
Yeah, kind of. It implies that. You could argue that it implies that. It's just that the definition of the tradition, again, is that if it comes up heads, then they do the chant, but only if they have not done the chant in a prior year. That's the definition.
I can't even see it any other way, though. Like, can you tell me any other scenario where it's even possible, even conceivable, where you could get ahead and they haven't done the chant before, and this somehow doesn't mean a first head? Can you even give me
No, I
another
don't
way?
think so.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So then the rules is if it's a first head, then you do the chant, right?
Sort of. It implies that.
Right.
It implies that there's a first heads. But at any rate, the point is that given the description of the tradition, if it comes up heads each year, this creates a contradiction.
I don't see that because they'll say something like, well, first of all, we need to flip a coin, and if it's head and we haven't done the chant before, so if we haven't gotten the first head before, then if we have just gotten a first head, we'll do the chant now. This society will be like, well, we've always gotten head, and the coins have always flipped head for eternity, right? Therefore, we just wouldn't do the chant then, because there is no first head. That's what this society would conclude.
Again, this is why the definition is important as is. The rule again is that if it comes up heads, then they do the chant if they have not done it in a prior year. That is the definition of the tradition. So is that condition met? Say the coin came up heads every year, and it came up heads for the first time last year.
Based on the rules, that condition was not met.
No, so they didn't do the chant. So the coin came up heads last year. Did they do the chant in the prior year? Yes or no?
No, because
well then by the definition then of the tradition, then they do the chant that year, because the rule is we do the chant if we had not done it in a prior year. Right.
So the first time they get ahead, they'll do it. And the second time, they will not do it because they've already done it before. That's kind of what you're saying. I'm just, I think we're getting lost in language, but I think that's exactly what it's saying. I can't even conceive of it any other way.
Yeah, okay, because remember, the point of the scenario is that it's logically impossible. So there was no first heads.
Correct. There's no first head because we have an infinite regress in this scenario, and it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But in this society, based on their own rules, they would just not do the chant. It would be like, listen, we've always gotten head. There's no first head at all. We're never going to do the chant. That's what the society would conclude.
No,
logically.
That's not the definition of the scenario. Okay, break it down into two parts. Now remember, suppose, if the coin came up heads last year, you're saying they hadn't done the chant prior to last year, right?
So if it came up head, it doesn't guarantee they'll do the chant, correct?
It depends whether they did the chant in the prior year. So again, if they've done the chant, if the heads have come up every year.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, the coin came up heads each year. Now, last year, did they do the chant last year? Had they done the chant any year prior to last year?
It depends, obviously. If there's another head, then no. And if it's like
came up heads, remember situation came up heads each year. Each year the infinite past. Now last
they never do the chant.
They never do the chant. Okay, so last year the coin came up heads. Now the definition of the tradition is that if the coin come up heads, then we do the chant if we have not done it in a prior year. That is the definition of the scenario. Now, according to that definition, do they do the chant last year if they hadn't done it in a prior year?
No, they don't. And then you see the paradox.
That's entailed by the. Entailed by the rule. The rule is we do the chant if it comes up heads if we have not done the chant in the prior year.
Right. So I'm trying to break down the language just to see how this is definitely saying if there's a first head, you do a chant. But I know you don't believe me right now, but let me just break it down. Maybe I'm confused.
Yes, you're confused. The definition of the rule is, I could use symbolic logic to prove that there's a contradiction if need be. I don't suppose you're familiar with propositional logic.
No, I think in your video you showed symbolic logic, and I was like, I'm not there, man. I'm not there yet. But break this down for me though. So there's two components to them doing the chant. One component is that they get a head, like they flip a coin and it comes up head. So then that's one component. Another component is that if they haven't done the chant before, they'll do it, right?
Yeah, if they haven't done the chant in a prior year, then they do the chant if the coin comes up heads.
Right. Question: if they haven't done it before, so if they haven't done it before, based on a head that came up, correct?
Well, sort of. The tradition is for a given year is simply, again, the definition of tradition is just they haven't done the chant that year. If a coin does not come up heads, then they do not do the chant for that year. So given this definition of the scenario, if they engage in the tradition every year, then it would mean that the coin, for them to do the chant before the coin would have to come up heads in a prior year. That is implied by the tradition.
Right. So let me give you some scenarios then, because I don't think I'm making headway. So if I get, for example, so just imagine can you imagine a numbered line with two infinities on both sides? Can you imagine this?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have infinity, infinity, infinity on the left-hand side, infinity, infinity, infinity on the right-hand side. We just have tails all the way on the left-hand side for infinity, right? But then all of a sudden, we get the first head. So we have tails, 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 all the way to infinity. Head, tails, 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 head, tails, 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 head. And then again, tails, 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 all the way to infinity on the right-hand side. So in this scenario, there is a first head. Based on the rules, they would do a chant. But if it's always been head, 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 there is no first head, right? It's just infinite. I know our minds, we don't live in this society, and this society is purely hypothetical, but try to plug yourself into this society. If you do, you'll see if there is no first head, they would never do the chant, and that's totally fine based on their own rules. It's just counterintuitive to us because, this is a thought experiment. Did that make sense or not? Am I just completely not making sense at all right now?
It's in addition to they couldn't have done the chant, it's also by the rules of the tradition, they had to have done the chant. Because the rule is, if it comes up heads, then we do the chant if we had not done the chant in a prior year. So they had to have done the chant, because the coin came up heads last year, and they would have done it then had they not done it before. But they also could not have done the chant, because in you point to, there is a prior year in which they would have done the chant had they not done the chant before. So that's the logical contradiction that scenario S2 implies.
Gotcha. I think we're a little stuck. Maybe it's good if we could, like, just for the sake of conversation, to move on. I just have one question for you. Do you think if I just make your language a little bit more simple, and just say that if there's the first head, they'll do the chant? Do you think that's?
Because I think that's confusing you, unfortunately, because.
You think it doesn't work though?
I think it's confusing you in this particular instance, because it's distracting you from what the implication is of the scenario. So again, let's break it out into two components. Now, you say they never did the chant, and the coin came up heads each year, right?
I'm sorry. So sorry. I keep spacing out because I'm just looking at my notes. Repeat that again.
Okay, I think it's easier if we just break it down into two components. Now, if the coin came up heads each year, they had never done the chant, right? They'd never done the chant before.
If the coin came up heads, they've never done the chant before?
Yeah, the coin came up heads each year of the infinite past, they had never done the chant, right? That's what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
Okay, now, on the rule, if the Eternal Society followed this rule last year, okay, the coin came up heads. We will do the chant this year because if we have never done it before. If they follow that specific rule, they would have done the chant last year, right?
No.
But they can't come up heads, right? Last year it came up heads.
Yep.
Right?
And
and there is no year prior to last year in which they have done the chant, right?
Right.
So those two conditions are met, right?
So we get heads, right? And if they get ahead, they'll. So let me see, because I'm having a hard time, and I don't even know if I'm confused or you're confused or we're both. I don't even know. So if we get ahead, we'll do the chant, but only one time, right?
No. Okay,
that's
not what I'm saying. That's not the condition I'm saying. So
I know I'm changing the language to.
Yes, but I think that's confusing you. I'm describing what is actually true in my language because this is the definition of the scenario. The definition of the tradition. A coin came up heads last year, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, condition 2. Have they done the chant in a prior year, in a year prior to last year? Is that condition met? Have they done the chant in a prior year?
No.
Okay. So those two conditions are met, right?
I just think the second part. So you're saying haven't done the chant.
In a prior year.
Right, but why haven't they done the first chant?
Because there is no first heads. So that is why a contradiction is established. Because they
Based
had
on
to run the chant, and yet they could not have done the chant. Because those, just last year, those conditions are met according to you.
So let me put it this way. So, and I'm so sorry. I'll go back to your vocabulary. Let me just change it for a little bit, just so you could see what I'm getting at. So if we get ahead, they'll do the chant, but only one time. Let me put, okay, so sorry. Let's just say this society is flipping coins, right? They only have a budget for one chant, okay? And as soon as they get the one head, they'll do the chant. But after that, any more heads, they will not do the chant anymore, okay? They only have the budget for one chant. And they'll use that budget when the first head comes up. After that, when, it's tails, head again, head for the second time or head for the third time, they will not do the chant anymore, right? That's what it sounds like based on your rules, right? We have a head, and then if they have a head, they'll do the chant. If they haven't done the chant before, but that haven't done the chant before requires there to be a head, and they'll only do this head one time. After that, they won't do it anymore. So this is why I'm saying a first head, right? And in this example, in S2, it's always head. So there is no first head. So this society would conclude, logically, that they just wouldn't do the chant. They just don't have the budget for that.
The scenario you're describing is not the condition of scenario S2. That's not the condition I was describing. Again, the coin came up heads each year. You're saying they've never done the chant, right?
Yes.
Okay, now let's think back to last year and see if those two conditions are met one by one. Okay, the coin came up heads last year, right?
That condition is met.
Okay, now, second condition. Is it true last year that they had not done the chant in a prior year?
That's okay. So I'm thinking about this. Maybe you have a point. Let me see. So in this example in S2, it's always been head. They've always flipped a coin and they've always gotten head instead of tails. So first condition is that they get a head, and the second condition is that they haven't done the chant before. Yeah, I would say that works for your example, but I find it too muddy.
So, you agree that those two conditions are met then, right?
Yeah, so I would say the eternal society paradox doesn't work.
So with those two conditions are met, the rule is if those two conditions are met, then they do the chant that year. So on that specific rule, they would have done the chant last year, right?
Let me see. Got a head, and then they haven't done the chant before. Okay, I think maybe I'm getting lost in language, or maybe you are, because when you said we haven't done the chant before, but that has like a hidden premise or like a hidden rule, and that's what I was getting at when I was saying the first head, right? So they need to get a head. They flip a coin, and if they get a head, go ahead.
Well, under ordinary circumstances, yes, it would be the first head, but these are not ordinary circumstances. In this circumstance, because there is no first head, this annual coin flipping tradition, when the coin come up heads each year, generates a logical contradiction because of the rule. Because by your own admission, those first two conditions are met last year. And because those first two conditions are met, on that rule, they would have done the chant last year, right?
You know, I know I said yes before, but I think my answer just switched to no.
Okay,
because
let's break it down. Now, if the coin are those two conditions met?
Not the second one. So it is a head.
Okay, so the second condition was they had not done the chant in a prior year. You disagree with that condition.
Let me see. They haven't done the chant in a prior year. And then if it's heads and they haven't done the chant, then they would do the chant. Hold on, I'm trying to mind my wrap my mind around this. Hold on. It's a head because my mind just switched again. Sorry. So they get a head, and then they haven't done the chant before. So then they would do the chant. That's the rule, right?
That's the rule, yes.
So they get a head, and then if they haven't done the chant before, then they'll do the chant. Yeah, based on those rules. So I think this is my answer, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be obtuse. Based on those rules, I would say, yeah, I do see the paradox. But I think the reason for the paradox could be because of sophistry. I think it's just bad language. I think what you're trying to get at is a first head. Because if a better way to phrase this is that they have a budget for like just a one-time chant, right? This culture will only have one chant in their whole existence. Is this correct?
No, that's not defined in this scenario. The definition of the annual coin flipping tradition is that each year they flip a coin. If it comes up heads and they have not done the chant in the prior year, then they do the chant that year. Otherwise, they do not do the chant for that year. That is the definition of the tradition.
Right. How is that different from a first head?
Because one way is that when it's defined this way, it is easier to show that a contradiction is engendered when the coin is comes up heads each year.
I know, but I think it's by design.
Huh?
I think this language is meant to like hide the the first head. I think it's, instead of saying that, it's meant to like hide that. But I think that's what it's trying to get at. That's what I think anyway. Because, for example, if it gets a tails, let's try to just make it.
Well, under ordinary circumstances, it would be a first head for a finite past. That doesn't work when the coin comes up heads each year of the infinite past. And that's why the way I worded it is very important, because the definition of the scenario as I worded it implies a contradiction if the coin comes up heads each year. Now, I can prove that this will lead to a logical contradiction by symbolic logic, because K through 12 education doesn't teach people symbolic logic. I'm going to have to rely on ordinary language. And that's why I say, are these two conditions met? If the coin came up heads last year, and if they have not done the chant in a prior year, then they did do the chant last year, and you agreed with that, right? Or have you changed your mind?
I've changed my mind a couple of times. I'm so sorry.
Okay,
because
so let's break
I
it
still
down.
I still think that when you say that specific vocabulary, then you are correct. There would be an issue with this society. It couldn't exist. But when you word it differently, when you just say a first head, then there is no issue. The issue goes away. And
okay, maybe it's true.
I can't even
have a different
conceptualize. Sorry, just real quick, because I think this is important. I can't even conceptualize how your rules are not even indicating a first head. And we could go through this further. Like, I could give you like scenarios of when you think it does or doesn't apply, just so you could see what I'm getting at. But I'm so sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is why I worded it very precisely in the way that I did, because if we have the scenario in the precise way that I described, we can prove using symbolic logic that this scenario engenders a logical contradiction. And by your own admission, if those first two conditions are met, last year, the coin came up heads. Second condition, they have not done the chant in a prior year. If those two conditions are met, then the rule, by the definition of the annual coin flipping tradition, is that they do the chant that year. Now, do you agree that those two conditions are met?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be obtuse, but I think the second one, it depends how you interpret it. And if I interpret it as the first head,
no, that's
then
not,
the
that's
answer is
not
no.
the correct interpretation. The correct interpretation of they have not done the chant in a prior year is that they have not done the chant in a prior year. That is the correct interpretation of the second condition.
But when you mix the first and the second condition, when you combine them, to me, it just spits out first head. And to interpret it any other way, I can't even conceive of it. Like, let me ask you a question. Sorry, go ahead.
That's kind of the point. The scenario S2 is inconceivable. It's logically
no, not S2.
That's
Sorry.
the point.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the rules. First rule, the coin needs to come up heads. And then the second rule is if they haven't done the chant before, then they'll do the chant. When those two rules are met, they'll do the chant. But when you combine both rules, that's just saying whenever there's a first head, you'll do the chant. That's what it comes out as.
I don't quite agree, because that rule, that implication is implied when you have a finite past. It doesn't work when you have an infinite past. So again, break it down. Are those two conditions met? Because remember, that is the definition of tradition. If it comes up heads.
Separately, yes, but together, no.
Okay,
maybe,
so let me get this straight. The first condition is met. You believe that, right?
Separately, yeah, but together, like, no.
Okay, one thing at a time. You believe the first condition is met, right?
Yep.
Okay. Do you believe the second condition is met?
Yep.
Okay. Do you believe that both the first and second conditions are met?
I know this sounds so weird, but I think the answer is when you combine both of them, it changes the meaning. So no, like let me before I sound like a total loony bin right here, because I know I'm sounding very crazy. Let me tell you why I think your rules are just saying first head, and then you do the chant. I'm gonna give you all the possible options that could be in this society, with just in four basic possible options, and you tell me if they do or don't do the chant. So if they get a first head, would this society do the chant? Yes or no?
In a finite past, yes.
If
it came up for the first time, Yes, they would do the chant if the coin came up heads.
Well, I think that's just in general, because in an infinite past, there is no first head, so it wouldn't really matter.
And
The rule still stands.
Are you talking about scenario S2? Okay, so
No, I'm getting a little bit away from your argument right now. I'm just seeing why your rules together, both of them, are actually saying first head. So don't think about your argument right now. Just think about the society that we're talking about, right? The society flips coins, and in what conditions would they actually do the chant? Let's just think about it.
By definition, is that the coin comes up heads, and they have not done the chant in a prior year.
Perfect. Okay, but now I'm saying let's apply those to see if I'm getting at something, or if I'm just not. If I'm just grasping at straws here. So if they get a tail, would they do the chant?
Not in that particular year, no.
Okay, gotcha. If they got a first tail, would that make a difference?
I don't believe so. If it's tails for the first time, then they would not have done the chant and win the year tails.
Gotcha. And I'm almost done. Thank you for your patience. If they flip a coin and they got a tail, but it's not the first tail, would they do the chant?
Not for that year. If the coin comes up tails.
Gotcha. Okay, if they flip a coin and they get a head, but it's not the first head, would they do the chant?
It depends whether they did the chant in a prior year.
But they didn't.
Okay, well, if it comes up heads, and if they have not done the chant in a prior year, then they would have done the chant that year.
Gotcha. So when you said if they haven't done the chant already, but they would only do the chant if it was head.
Well, that depends. If the annual coin flipping tradition is practiced every year or not.
But in this example, it is, right?
Well, this is your scenario, so you tell me.
No, I'm using exact same scenario. I'm just not using your argument right now.
Exact same scenario as what?
So just think about the society you built. They flip coins, and
Okay,
they either
so
get...
talking about a scenario in which the Eternal Society exists, and they practice the annual coin flipping tradition each year of its beginningless infinite existence. Am I correct so far?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so here, let me just see what I was getting at. See if you know, and then we could move on probably, because maybe I just need to think about it more. So in this society, if they flip a tail, like tails for the first time, they wouldn't do the chant. If they
Not
flip...
in the year in which they did tails. No, not in that particular year.
Right. And I'm sorry, every single time I'm talking about this year. Like, when do we do the chant? Now or later, right? Because they can only do the chant one time based on these rules. Because once they do it, then they've already done it. And the second rule is that, they only get to do it once.
So that's not the definition of the tradition. Again, it's very important to get the tradition exactly right. The tradition is they flip a coin. And if the coin come up heads, then they do the chant, but only if they have not done the chant in a prior year. Otherwise, They do not do the chant in that particular year. That is the precise definition of the annual coin flipping tradition.
Right. And then once they do the chant, would they ever do the chant again?
I don't believe so. That does seem to be implied by their tradition.
Right.
If they have done the chant, because presumably in future years, it will be true that they have done the chant in a prior year.
Right, and I'm not saying just implied, it's like it's required. I don't see any other way. Like, they'll do the chant, and then they've already done it. So the second condition is if they haven't done it before. So if they do it once, they just won't do the chant anymore in this society. And then the first condition was heads. So that's what I'm saying, first head. I don't know if I'm making any grounds. Just to finish quickly, maybe we could get off this topic. We flip a coin and we get a tails for the first time. That year, they wouldn't do the chant. If they flip a coin and they get tails, and it's not the first time they've gotten tails, they wouldn't do the chant that year. If they flip the coin and they get heads, but it's not their first head, they wouldn't do the chant. But if they flip a coin and that's the first time they've gotten ahead, then they would do the chant. So to me, it seems like the only condition, based on the rules you set, is a first head. And then S2, this society wouldn't feel pressured at all to do the chant, because they would just interpret it the way I do, I think. But maybe I'm wrong. They would say,
just remember,
no first head, then we're not going to do the chant. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so you're both correct and not correct. Here's why. It is true that if they have done the first heads, if it's not the first heads, then they don't do the chant. But it's also true that they would do the chant. Because the conditions of the scenario imply contradiction. They imply that they would have done the chant, and it implies that they would not have done the chant. And as for why they couldn't have done the chant, is because any year you point to, there's a year prior to it in which they would not have done the chant before. Now, the question I think you're struggling with is, given the definition of the tradition, would it be true that they had to have done the chant? Now, you said they would have not done the chant at any year, but those two conditions aren't met. So there's a rule of logic called conjunction introduction, where if A is true and B is true, then both A and B are true. So
how do you feel
that you're rejecting that particular rule of logic when it comes to those particular two conditions? Is that correct? You don't think the rule of logic applies in scenario S2?
Well, how do you feel about like emergent properties? Because I feel like it's kind of like that right now. Like it just sounds weird, but like, A is true, okay, then B is true. But when you make sorry. If A is true and then B is true, and then you say A and B, that's obviously true. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the rules change. They're true. Sorry, I almost went on a crazy train over here. If this society had only one rule, okay? So let's step back for a moment. If this society only had one rule, if we flip ahead, we'll do a chant. That's fine. If the society had another rule, that if they flip... let me see. How do I word the second part of the rule? Yeah, because the second part of the rule is combined like with the first part. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so let's break it down. Okay, so the first condition is it came up heads last year. That first condition is met, right? It came up heads last year.
Yeah, and S2,
okay.
Yeah.
The second condition is they have not done the chant in a prior year. Is that condition met?
Yep.
Okay, then it's true that both of those conditions are met. Or do you disagree?
And I know this sounds loony bin. I'm hearing myself, but I am telling you that that's not like.
Okay, if you disagree with that, then you're denying that the rule of logic known as conjunction introduction does not apply in this scenario. Is that what you believe, that the rule of conjunction introduction does not apply in this scenario?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm saying that.
Okay, so the rule of conjunction, again...
I'm saying that the interpretation...
If A is true and B is true, then both A and B are true. That is the rule of logic. Now, if the first condition... So, if that rule of logic is valid, that is, it's truth-preserving in all instances, where you have... then it would imply that if the first condition is met, then the second condition is met. Then both conditions are met. But you're saying that is not correct. Is that right?
It's because I think when you're saying the second condition, I think it's just so combined to the first condition, right? It's not, if they haven't done the chant. So sorry, I'm trying to navigate this right now.
Okay, so just right. Okay, so you believe the first condition is met, and you believe the second condition is met, but you do not believe that both conditions are met. Is that correct?
I'm just saying when you mix both conditions, it spits out first head for me. Like that's what I'm saying. Like there's like when you mix rules together, you just get like a different style of play. I don't know if I'm even making sense right now. So sorry.
Okay, well, just try answering my question. You believe the first condition is met, right?
Yeah, they got ahead.
Okay. The second condition, they have not done the chant in the prior year, is also met, right?
Let me think of that one. Haven't done a chant.
Haven't done the chant in a prior year.
Right.
But you believe it is not the case that both those conditions are met. Is that correct?
Yes
no.
No. I do believe both have been met, but I don't believe they'll do the chant.
Well, okay, the rule. Okay, if both conditions are met, and the rule is, if both conditions are met, we'll do the chant. Then they would have done the chant in that year, right? If they follow that rule.
Yeah, I would say if they follow those specific rules that you have, yes.
Okay, so
but
then they do the chant because that is the definition of the annual coin flipping tradition. If those two conditions are met, then they do the chant. Again, very important. That is the definition of the annual coin flipping tradition.
Gotcha. But what I'm wrestling with, and I don't know how seriously you take this objection, but both of those rules to me sound like you're saying a first head. I can't conceive of a scenario where that's not the case. You know, like if we get a head for the second time, we wouldn't do the chant, right? If we get the first tail, we wouldn't do the chant either. And if we get a head for the a tails for the fifth time, we also wouldn't do the chant. The only condition I'm seeing for us to do the chant based on your rules is the first head. And that's where I'm
true
stuck.
Under ordinary conditions. The reason why scenario S2 is so weird is precisely because it's a logical impossibility. It implies a logical contradiction. It implies that they could not have done the chant because there is no first heads. But it also implies that they had to have done the chant because of the definition of the annual coin flipping tradition, which says if it comes up heads, they do the chant then if they had not done it in a prior year. So both are true. They could not have done the chant in any year, but they also had to have done the chant because those first two conditions are met last year.
Right. They'll do the chant if they haven't done the chant before, if they get a head. But to me, that just sounds like a first head. You know, like I can't even think about it any other way.
But you agree that those first two conditions are met, and on that rule, they had done the chant last year.
They got a head, and then they haven't done the chant before, and then those rules state that therefore you'll do a chant.
Right.
But if you
remember, the situation, the point of scenario S2, that premise says there's a logical contradiction here. These rules, combined with the probabilistic, with the random outcome of heads each year, those rules together with the outcome imply a contradiction. They never did the chant. It's impossible for them to have ever done the chant, and yet they had to have done the chant by the rules of the tradition. That's the point of that premise.
Gotcha. The second component, I think that's what I'm just super stuck on. So the first component is you have to have a head. The second component is that if you haven't done the chant before, and then the conclusion is you'll just do the chant that
if
one
they follow
time.
That rule, yes.
Gotcha. So those are the two rules from what I'm seeing. You have to get a head, and then the second rule is if you haven't done it before.
Well, second condition anyway. Second criteria.
Sorry, second condition. That second condition, can you define that further? Because I think that's where the confusion lies. Like if you haven't done the chant before.
Yes.
If you haven't done
there
the chant,
does not exist a year prior to the current year at which they have done the chant.
Right. So if they've never done the chant before, they'll do it now. But it's not just that. It's if they haven't done the chant before and gotten ahead before. So that's first
if
head.
They came up heads and they have not done the chant in a prior year, then they will do the chant. That is the definition of that tradition.
Right. And to me, that just reads like whenever they flip their first head on that coin, that's when they'll do the chant, and that's it. That's exactly what it's sounding like to me. I to be honest, I can't even see it any other way. So
I get that part, but you still agree that those two conditions are met, and therefore, if those two conditions are met, then they would have done the chant last year. So they had to do the chant last year, and yet they could not have done the chant. That's a contradiction, right?
Right, and here's what I'm having trouble with. Like when I look at the rules separately, like 1 and 2, or the conditions separately, I totally see that. But when I pay attention closely at the second condition, it sounds like it's totally mixed with the first condition. Like you cannot separate these. I guess you could, but in this example, it's mixed, right? So sorry, my mind right now, it's a little scattered.
Okay, it's important to remember So I think like maybe the implications are confusing you a bit. It's important to remember the definition of the actual tradition. The coin comes up heads, and they have not done the chant in a prior year, then they do the chant. It's important to remember those specific two conditions as worded so as to not get confused.
Gotcha. So, and just follow me right now. It's related because I'm actually trying to understand what you're putting down, but I don't think I'm following sometimes. If you flip ahead for the first time, would they do the chant that year? Yes or no?
It depends if they had not done the chant in the prior year.
But I don't think it depends. 'Cause I think it must be the case based on those rules, right? Like it's like a first head.
Okay, are you assuming that the Eternal Society has followed this rule every year for an infinite past?
Right. So I'm taking Eternal Society like this. You flip a coin every year, every single year, and if they end up rolling ahead, they'll do the chant. If they haven't done it before, to me that reads exactly like whenever they flip their first head, they'll do the chant. It reads exactly like that. And I can't even conceive of it any other way. So I'm trying to give you scenarios so you could help me out. Like, can you give me one condition where your rules would not imply a first head? Because I just don't see it.
Where the coin come up heads each year.
See, and here's the thing. Like, maybe that's right, right? Yeah, maybe that's right. I'll think about that a little bit more, okay?
Okie dokie.
Sure, let me move on. How much time do we have left?
I can go on for maybe an hour and a half.
Okay, got you. I got some notes here. Give me a second. I was going to bring up another objection, and then this time with like my own argument. So I could totally see how an infinite regress is hard to imagine. In some conditions, an infinite regress makes sense. In some conditions, it does not. But I have an even harder time making sense of a first cause that is timeless. That's even more harder to conceive. It's contradictory to my common experience. But again, like I do not experience cosmic scales, right? So maybe this is why an infinite regress doesn't make sense to me, or maybe this is why a first cause doesn't make sense to me. That's timeless, right? Maybe that's why it doesn't make sense to me. And let me explain like why. So actually, I do have an argument here. Hold on.
Well, it'd certainly be different. I mean, it's kind of like a de facto supernatural cause in the sense that a cause transcending space and time, causally affecting something like creating a universe is radically different from would have to operate very differently from the physical laws as we know them today. So I mean, I could get it'd be kind of hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, because like outside of time, there isn't even any change. There's just being and non-being. So that's why, like, if I were an atheist, I would say that, you know, in light of, say, the Eternal Society paradox argument, like, yeah, the past is probably finite, and there just has to be some first cause, but the cause is, like, impersonal. But the fact, if it is so, that we do have some sort of cause transcending space and time, creating the universe, would make atheism less plausible than it would have been than without that evidence. So I think even though I were an atheist, I would say that, okay, the first cause does the existence of a finite past and the necessity of a transcendent first cause does lend some evidence for theism. And I would just, as an atheist, I'd probably have to, my atheist hat. I would say it's like, okay, you got some evidence for theism, but it's not enough evidence because you need to get from a first cause to a personal cause, and I don't think you've done enough work to do that. That's what I would do if I were an atheist. Say first cause, but I don't think it's a personal cause.
What do you think about this objection that an atheist can say? Sure, it could be supernatural, or it could just be the unknown natural. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, the reason I said a de facto supernatural first cause is that it has to be very different from the physical laws as we know them. So you could say, I mean, it's sort of like, it depends on semantics of how you're defining supernatural, I guess. But you could say like an impersonal physical cause, but very different from the laws of the universe. That's why I say de facto supernatural, even if it's not actually supernatural. The important part for the atheist, I think, is that the cause is not a personal cause. And I think if the atheists could do that, they can avoid theism.
Gotcha. Because supernatural, it just seems so undefined to me. Like, I don't even understand what people are saying. I'll tell you.
Here's one way to kind of look at it. Is that if you have a mind that doesn't have any other underlying ontological basis. So think of like human minds. So many naturalists believe that our minds have a kind of a physical substrate, like either like the electrochemical reactions producing mental phenomenon, or that perhaps more implausibly, that the mental phenomenon just is the same thing as the electrochemical reactions, which I find less plausible. The idea is that you have that either way, you have that underlying substrate. The physical stuff produces the mental stuff, somehow. Now, I think where a lot of theists believe, all of this isn't strictly entailed by theists. A lot of theists believe that God is an incorporeal mind, that he has a mind but doesn't have any further ontological foundation. I think the reason why, I suspect anyway, that the reason a lot of theists think that is that it allows for a simpler ontology. The idea that it's like a simpler explanation is the best one. So if you have a mind creating universe, it's simpler to say that the mind has no ontological foundation. That's responsible for everything outside of itself. And someone who kind of likes Occam's razor, I'm kind of attracted to that myself. But that's kind of one way to think of the supernatural, is that if you have a mind but exists without any further ontological basis, that doesn't have any like physical attached to it, then that would qualify as supernatural. That seems to be at least one fashion of supernaturalism that a lot of people seem to have in mind.
Gotcha. And I would say I don't probably agree with that read of Occam's razor. Like, to me, it's not just remove components and whatever has less components or is more simple is true or more likely true.
Well, the idea is that all else held constant, the simpler explanation is the best one.
I know, but I'm trying to say, what does more simple mean, right? And if it just means less components, I don't agree with that. It's less assumptions. Like, if we can see something empirically, then that's not really a baggage. It's what we cannot see, and we have to add to our models. That's what's baggage, right?
But yeah, if I mean components like components to a theory. So fewer assumptions would work well here too.
I think it works better because... You could... Sorry, you muted yourself. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So that's one way you could do it. I was like, when I say components, I kind of left it vague and open as to what those components are. And if those components are simply like assumptions, yeah, you could do it that way. But I think the reason a lot of theists are attracted to the idea of God being incorporeal is that, yeah, you have like the kind of the simplest in terms of components. In terms of ontological components, like all else held constant. If you could explain, if all other factors are held constant, you could explain something with like 10 components versus one component. All other factors held constant, like in terms of ontological realities, you would prefer the one that posits fewer components.
Yeah, but I don't think so. Like, you need to get a little bit more like precise, because I would say, like, if I had a model that had a lot of components, but all of these components were empirically verified, that's not really a problem. And if your model had less components, but they were not empirically verified,
that's why I
and
said
your model
all else
couldn't
held
predict.
constant. That's why I said if all other relevant factors were held constant, that's an important condition.
Gotcha. But I think that's what I'm saying. We have to get a little more precise, But I think maybe we don't agree on that. Sorry, we don't disagree on that. Let me go quickly to my argument. I was saying that in infinite regress, it's hard to It's hard to wrap my mind around in infinite regress, right? Just eternity all the way to the past and all the way to the future. That sounds very hard to imagine. A universe that's like looping is also hard to imagine. A universe that has a beginning, a first cause, and is infinite to the future is hard to imagine. And it would also be hard to imagine like a universe that has like an infinite past, but like an ending point to the future. And to me, it's so. Anyway, all these things are hard to imagine for me. And let me present you an argument. See what you think about it. Okay, so here, this argument is why it's just hard it's equally hard or even harder to imagine a first cause that's timeless. It's even harder than like a infinite regress. So here's the argument. Premise 1. If anything exists for 0 seconds, then it doesn't objectively exist. Premise 2. God objectively existed before time in a timeless form. Premise 3, but premise 2 cannot have happened. Couldn't have happened since it contradicts premise 1. Conclusion, a timeless God doesn't objectively exist. So I think my argument in full is saying, how can anything exist for 0 seconds? Doesn't even make sense to me.
I don't think any theist is saying that God existed before the beginning of time. That's not the position. Because there is
time is
before
emergent?
the beginning of time. So God is ontologically prior to the universe, but not temporally prior to the universe. So in philosophy, something is ontologically prior is if the universe basically owes its existence to God, but it doesn't. But God isn't temporally prior to the universe.
Right, but you do believe that after some time, this is going to sound weird. Do you believe after some time there was no time?
No.
Do you believe God? You believe God is timeless?
Well, I think he's timeless, at least in the absence. Well, sans the universe. I think it's how William Lane Craig put it. So
Sorry, repeat that again.
So there is no period of time in which God just basically does nothing and then created the universe. It's very different from that. It is hard to wrap your mind around. I'm not doubting that. But it just seems to me that, given the impossibility of an infinite past, a first cause, although strange and difficult to wrap your head around, seems to be the only viable option left. Is some sort of transcendent cause, some cause transcending space and time, creating the universe. Again, hard to get your head around, but the past is, if an infinite past is impossible, that seems to be the most likely theory.
But if you tell me that something is nowhere and at no time, like it transcends space and it transcends time, and to me that sounds like something that doesn't exist. You know, like for example, I can imagine a magical pet dragon, and that thing exists nowhere at no time at no place. You know, it's timeless too. So I just don't see how saying something is timeless to me it sounds like the same as it doesn't exist.
Well, it's again, I agree that it's hard to wrap your head around. But it's also not logically contradictory. There's nothing contradictory of something transcending space and time, creating a universe. Just like, think of like a fourth spatial dimension. Can I imagine it? No. I can't imagine a fourth spatial dimension. Does it mean that it therefore doesn't exist or that it's logically contradictory? Well, no, it doesn't. But just because it's hard to wrap my mind around a fourth spatial dimension, it doesn't imply that it doesn't exist.
Well, I made an argument, right? And you said yourself, like, what premise is wrong?
I already said that the second premise is wrong. The idea that God existed before time, I don't think that's true. God is ontologically prior to the universe, but not temporally prior.
Do you think God is timeless?
I don't think he's timeless now, because now that there's time, I don't think he's timeless.
Was he timeless before?
Not temporally before the universe, no.
Was he timeless at any point?
Timeless at any point in time, you mean?
Well, again, sounds contradictory to me. So, to me,
are you asking if God was timeless at any point in time? Is that what you're asking?
Does God transcend space and time?
I think he did sans the universe. I think he's in time right now.
Was he ever not in time?
When you say ever, do you mean was there ever a point in time in which he was not in time? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I mean, I think that would be an issue for the theist, but not precisely. I'm just saying, was God always in time? That's what I'm saying. You're saying God is in time. You said God is in time now. That to me is implying something. So I'm just asking. I don't want to assume. What does that mean? Are you saying that God was always in time, or what exactly are you saying?
At all points in time, God was present in time.
And is that God's full ontology?
I'm not sure what you mean by full ontology. If you're asking...
Has God always been in time, and that's the only way he's been? And that's the only way he could be?
Has God always been in time? Do you mean at every point in time has he been in time? Is that your question?
I mean, I don't know. I mean... I don't know how I'm trying to word it different ways because it sounds awkward. But again, I think that's an issue for the theist.
Well, because they're talking about because you're the one asking the question. I have to know what your question means if I'm going to answer it.
Well, that's kind of the problem. What the hell does it even mean? You know, transcends space and time I can't even wrap my head around it. Can somebody help me wrap my head around it? Because that's what theists are saying.
Well, some theists anyway. I mean, it depends on theists, but I think that is the most likely option, is that there's a cause transcending space and time that sans the universe.
Right.
God was timeless.
Right, and that's what I'm saying.
Logically prior, but not temporally prior to the first moment in time.
Right, that's what I'm saying. You said that, and I'm like, well, what do you mean? And then I'm trying to phrase it, but it's awkward because the whole ideal is awkward. The whole idea is awkward. And then you're telling me, what do you mean? I don't know what it means. I'm so sorry.
It's okay if you're having difficulty understanding it, because it's, even though it's not logically contradictory, it's hard to wrap your head around, just like it's hard to wrap your head around a fourth spatial dimension. Like, I can't imagine a fourth spatial dimension. I can't imagine a hypercube, for example. I think that's just maybe the limitations of human imagination for a lot of people. I can understand the words, but I can't like picture it in my mind exactly, except for maybe like a diagram or something.
Yeah, and the best way
picture a hypercube.
The best way I've heard of talking about dimensions is Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was saying it's like coordinate points, like how much data you can give me so we can meet, or so that we can like do something, so we could get something specific to happen. Like he was saying, like you can give me an X, a Y, and a Z axis, like in spatial coordinates, so that we can meet up. Like you can give me 2 streets and then like the building number, so I know when to meet up. And then you can give me an extra dimension. You can give me the time dimension, so I know when we can meet up, right?
Well, this wasn't a time dimension. It was a spatial dimension. If you want to have a better idea of what a fourth spatial dimension is, I recommend a novel called Flatland. It's a classic.
I'll be honest, I don't believe in like Flatland. I don't believe in 2 dimensions, like spatial dimensions.
No, this is a novel. It's fantasy. It's not real.
No, I'm saying
the novel is called Flatland, but if you read it, you'd have a kind of maybe a better understanding. It's a classic in science fiction. Basically, every nerd should read it.
No, I know what you're saying, and like but I've heard people like use Flatland to like try to imagine higher dimensions. So, because like we experience 3 dimensions, maybe if we try to explain 2 dimensions, maybe we can explain higher dimensions. I just don't think that works, because I cannot even imagine 2 dimensions. Truly, I cannot. Because even a pixel on the television or on the computer screen, even if you draw a square on a piece of paper, that's a 2-dimensional square, but it's not really 2 dimensions, right? Because the graphite on the paper, that has some thickness, some width. So I always see length, width, and height. Do you know what I'm saying or no?
Yeah, I mean, 2D isn't something we quite, literal 2 dimension isn't something we experience in real world. Nevertheless, I would recommend the novel Flatland. It's a pretty easy read. It's a classic. Gotcha. Was there any other argument or anything else you wanted to discuss? Or
yes. Just real quick. And I've heard physicists make the case for like an infinite regress. I think I told you before, Penrose, and anybody who wants to see it probably should. You could just Google like Roger Penrose, CCC. I think it's cyclic cosmology, something like that model. Cyclic conformal cosmology model or something like that. He has an infinite regress model. I've seen physicists, and here's the thing, like I have heard physicists say this, that time is emergent or something like that. I don't like that idea because I do not understand it. But maybe it's true, right? Maybe just because I can't understand a first cause, that doesn't mean it's not true. And I think the same would be for infinite regress.
But the premise you were willing to deny, because I gave an argument against the impossibility of an infinite past. Yep. And your projection was the idea that scenario S2 is somehow not logically possible. Yep.
And then I give an argument for the why I find like a first cause that's timeless or that transcends time, however you want to put it. I can't even make sense of it in my head, and I think that's what we were kind of struggling with. But
for that, I reject the premise too. I don't think it's true that God existed before time. I think that's logically incoherent.
Gotcha. Well, I agree with that. But maybe we could switch premise 2 to something like, let me change the argument then a little bit to like language that you like better. The argument could be something like premise 1. If anything exists for 0 seconds, then it doesn't objectively exist. Premise 2, God transcends time. Um, premise three, but premise two couldn't have happened because it contradicts premise one. Conclusion: this God that transcends time does not objectively exist. Does that
I
work
don't
better?
believe God existed for 0 seconds. That's not part of my theology.
What does a God that transcends time mean?
In this case, my theology is that God was timeless, stands the universe. So it wasn't 0 seconds. It's that just the number doesn't even apply without the universe because there is no time.
Right, no time. And how else would we write no time with a zero? Zero represents none of that.
No, because it just doesn't apply.
I know. Like if I was selling no apples, right? It doesn't apply. Apples does not apply.
Okay, here's an example of what I mean. How many times did you stop beating your wife? Well, you never beat your wife, so the time doesn't really apply.
Write zero. No, but I would write 0 seconds.
You did. Okay, so you never stopped beating your wife, because that's what implies mean 0. There were 0 times where I stopped beating my wife.
So sorry. You reversed it there. Repeat it again.
How many times did you stop beating your wife?
How many times did I stop beating my wife? I didn't beat my wife. That sounds like I'm so sorry.
Yeah, because
I don't know if this sounds
like, have you stopped beating your wife? You can't give a yes or no answer to that, precisely because it implicitly assumes.
No, Sorry, I agree with your example, but I don't think that's applicable to all examples. I think that's like a trick question. It sounds a little bit like the.
That's kind of the point. So, when you say God exists for 0 seconds, well, no, there is no time. So the question doesn't really apply. Just like how many times did you stop beating your wife? Well, if you say, if you say, 0, that implies that you've never stopped beating your wife. And
no, it's because that's
the number doesn't really apply there.
But the reason I said a trick question is because that's a double blind. Yes or a no. A double blind means like a catch-22 or something like that. I don't know if you heard the term. It's like if you say
catch-22, I've never heard of double blind except in the context of like a double blind peer review study.
Oh, sorry, double bind. I'm so sorry.
Okay, yeah, that sounds more correct.
Yeah, it's
even so, I wouldn't say that. So maybe what you really mean to ask is that if something does not exist in time, then it doesn't exist. That seems to be more what you're saying, what that premise actually is intended to mean. But then it's a sort of question begging, because I do think that it's at least conceivable. There's nothing contradictory about an entity existing in a timeless state. We can imagine.
How? I can imagine it in a possible world, but yeah. I just can't imagine it doing the things that it does. Like, actually can't even imagine that. So I can imagine, for example, something that's still and doesn't move. So that's time not advancing. I can imagine that. But I cannot actually imagine something that existed for 0 seconds. I cannot imagine that.
Well, it's not 0 seconds. There's no time. Just like there's an idea in philosophy of non-metric time, where you can have some events earlier than others, but there's no measurement of time as in terms of seconds or minutes or anything like that. That's another idea in philosophy. Now, it's hard to wrap your mind about non-metric time. But some people believe in it, and there's nothing logically contradictory about it. Same thing with entities existing in a timeless state, where there is no change, only being and non-being, in a timeless, state.
I was going to go.
Yeah, we gotta I know your intuitive perceptions tell you that things just can't exist in a timeless state. That seems to be your intuition, and that seems to be where you're going with the idea that 0 seconds doesn't exist.
Well, just real quick, I was going to go back to the objection that you brought up before. Like I said it's like a double bind or like a catch-22, because it doesn't matter what answer I give. If I give a yes or if I give a no, it's the same answer. It comes out. So I think that's why I said trick question. It's like
the same answer doesn't come out, but the same implication that you had beat your wife in the past does come out.
Right, the same answer. It doesn't matter what I answer. The same answer comes out. Basically, by the way you set up the question.
The implication is the same either way, more precisely.
Well, okay. So, for example, like, I hope this is not too vulgar, but like, like a common one when I was younger was like, does your mom know you're gay? Right? So, like, if you said yes, I know my mom. I know. Yeah, so, if you said yes or no, that means you're gay either way, right? Because that's how the question was set up, right? Like, if you say yes, then your mom knows you're gay. If you say no, then your mom doesn't know you're gay. But either way, you're gay.
It's a loaded question, and it contains an implicit assumption which is incorrect.
Right, and I think that's what you kind of...
have you stopped beating your wife? That it contains an implicit assumption that is incorrect.
Right, and I don't think I was loading the question, though. Because, like,
the question is, like, if you say, has God existed in the absence of time, has God existed for 0 seconds? That seems to contain the implicit assumption that God is not in a timeless state, because the question doesn't really apply for timeless entities. There is no time for which it existed. Just like you haven't beat your wife, for example.
I don't think those are equivalent. Let me explain why. So, for example, if I was not selling apples, right? If my shop did not sell apples, I have two options. I could just say nothing because it doesn't apply. I'm not selling apples. I sell chocolate bars, just in this hypothetical. Or I can actually write on the board, 0 apples. That's the same thing, though. If there's no apples in the store, I can either say nothing or I can write 0 apples. Both of those are equivalent to me. Now, I don't think I'm loading the question here, but what do you think about that?
Well, in that particular case, I suppose that's true. But I think when you're saying, has God existed for 0 seconds, I mean, that doesn't seem to apply in the case of a timeless being, I think. But suppose by 0 seconds, you mean that it's such that if an entity is in a timeless state and has not and has not endured a temporal duration of any kind, then you say, okay, that being has existed for 0 seconds. Maybe that's what you mean by existing for 0 seconds, in a way that it encompasses being timeless. Now, in that premise, is it true that God has existed for 0 seconds on my theology? And the answer is no. He's existed for a lot of seconds, because I think he's in time right now.
Gotcha. And there's still like a way that I don't know if it even makes sense, but like I'm thinking about like acceleration, and then I'm thinking about like speed, right? So I could imagine something that's frozen in time, right? And if something is frozen in time, it has like no acceleration, right? It did exist, it does exist for some time, but the time has stopped, change has stopped. I just cannot imagine something with like no time at all. Like that doesn't make sense to me. What does that even mean? Like it sounds like if something has 0 acceleration but has speed, that's okay. But if something has 0 acceleration and 0 speed, and yet you're saying that it's moving, that doesn't make sense to me. And I think that
doesn't make sense to me either. If it has 0 acceleration and 0 speed, but of course that doesn't apply, at least not literally in this case.
Yeah, and if time is not advancing for God, that okay. And if there is no time for God because he transcends time, that is like that's what it sounds like to me. It makes no sense. I can't even make sense of it. What do you mean 0 time for God? Like I was saying, my pet dragon existed for 0 seconds as well. It sounds like nothing, you know? Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, that's your intuitive perceptions, but yeah, I guess maybe your intuitive perceptions and mine differ. It seems coherent to me that an entity can exist timelessly, sans the universe, and create it. There's certainly no logical contradiction in that, even though it is hard to wrap your head around.
Gotcha. And I think it's time that we move on. I think I have one final objection. I think I already gave it, so we don't have to stick too much into it. But I think it's good if we get into your epistemology. Hold on, give me a second. Okay. Just ordering my notes here. Where? Okay. Do you want to present your other argument, like the psychological harmony or something like that? Or do you think it's too late?
That's probably best saved for another episode. This is already getting pretty long as it is. I mean, we spent an hour and a half mostly on just one premise of the eternal society paradox argument.
Gotcha, yeah. I will look more closely into that. I don't think we should open that can of worms again. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Can you help me understand something? So I think on the last conversation we had, I was telling you that I don't agree with having a priori knowledge of God or anything like that. And I was telling you that like even our imagination is built on prior experience, right? Like
Well,
I
I
can
agree. I don't
experience.
believe in a priori knowledge of God either. I think we know God through experience.
Oh, gotcha. So we were talking about like intuitions, right? And you were saying that if something looks harmonious or orderly or has design or something like that,
Oh, that was
um,
the you're talking about a teleological argument that we just discussed.
yeah, like if something has order, then to you that
Certain types of order, anyway. Like the analogy I used was imagine there's an asteroid shower that spells out on the moon. Yes, there is a cosmic designer. I fine tune certain parameters so that this asteroid shower would show up with this text.
mhm,
And scientists discover that yes, there are certain parameters in the early universe that if they're altered even by more than a hair's breadth, no meteor shower text would appear. We would conclude that probably this was the result of a design. When if the asteroid shower were more scattershot with really no meaningful pattern at all, we would not conclude that it was designed. But because of that
right,
particular type of order in this asteroid shower scenario, fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario, we would include that probably it was a product of design.
right,
So really, all matters is like, okay, if there's a certain type of order, that it seems like a design inference is reasonable.
and I would say it depends. That's what I was saying. Like in this example,
Yeah, that's what I said.
yes,
It
like
depends.
if
It
it's
depends on the
spelling
type of
out,
order.
no, but like if it's spelling out like something, like we know via experience that conscious beings, like for example us humans, we have language. So if we see language out there, obviously we would think that it's a consciousness. But that's
Okay,
because
so
we.
if we had found this text in nature, would we conclude it's conscious?
Oh, that's the thing. So let's go into hypothetical. And like your intuitions here can really fight against you because it's really hard to enter hypotheticals with a clear mind. But that's what you kind of have to do for hypotheticals. If we lived in a world where language just naturally came about, we wouldn't have that intuition that language implies consciousness.
Okay, now hold it right there. Hold that
Hold it.
thought, okay?
Holding,
That's what
holding.
you're saying. If we found this in nature, we wouldn't include that it was a product of design, right? In this fine-tuned
If
asteroid shower, that is exactly what we have. This text is found in nature. So why can't we just say, well, look, I guess after all, this nature can produce this without any conscious intelligence at all.
because
Why
that
wouldn't we include
hypothetical
that here?
because that hypothetical you're bringing it into our real world, and in this world that's not how it works. In this world, when you look, so again, I was telling you empiricism is key here. When you look outside and you see order, you see conscious beings doing that order, so that builds that intuition up, right? Again, bees have beehives, beavers do their dams or whatever, humans write computer code language. So this is how, like, so we build the intuition that like orderly things produce is produced by consciousness, and language specifically. We've only seen language produced by humans. So if we see language written somewhere else, sorry, if we see language written blah blah blah. Sorry, if we see language written somewhere else out there, we would assume a consciousness made it based on our experience. Um, I was going to add something else. Oh yeah. When we also look at nature, we see orderly things coming about by beings that are not conscious. Like I give you an example, like ice crystals. Those things look very complicated. They look very orderly, and we don't have any markers for design. We don't see any creatures. We don't see anything making this order. So this is how our intuitions can get skewed if we're letting confirmation bias take place. So sorry, I spoke a lot. Go ahead.
Okay. Um, yeah, I guess so. Well, I would sort of disagree that the ice crystals weren't ultimately the product of order because I believe that God created the universe. We have these algorithms imprinted everywhere. But the general idea of how we infer design in practice, a lot of the times, is that if there's the event in question has a low probability, and that low probability fits a specific pattern, like in this case, text. Now, why do we think that if we see the fine-tuned asteroid shower? I think part of it is that we think it's like something a mind might create. I think that's the factor. If it's the type of effect that a mind might create, that's a relevant factor why we infer design there. Instead of saying, well, I guess text can be produced by nature after all without a conscious mind. Even though this is in nature, and it has produced this type of order, we still conclude that probably a designing intelligence was behind it. And I think that's one of the factors responsible for that intuition. You there?
Sorry, I muted. Yeah, I muted myself. Sorry about that. Yeah, and I would say that, and you agreed with me, right? Like this intuition is not a priori. This intuition is built by your senses, correct?
I'm not really sure I agree with that. I think, well, because I think that a lot of the intuition for us is that if it's something that a mind might create, and maybe that is built to some degree through experience, but we just kind of like even just introspection where I look at my mind is like a text, given my experience, something that I might create. So I think that experience does play a role. But then if you say that, well, it's because we never found it in nature before, and that's why we conclude that an intelligence was behind it. Well, here we have a case where it is found in nature, and we still conclude that an intelligence was behind it. So I don't think so. Experience plays some role, but I think it has its limits. Like because even when we do find this type of order in nature, we still conclude that a designing intelligence was behind it, and maybe that just has something to do with experience with our minds and other minds to see how they work, to give an idea of what a mind might create, and that plays a role. So, but just as that thing is found in text, like that's something a mind might create, I think the same thing is also true with algorithmic structures in the computer. That the fact that what I discussed in our last conversation, that we find that our universe is a software universe, not a randomized hard drive universe, because that's something a mind might create. That is what we have experience with. Right. But I don't want to resurrect that because we've already discussed it. This is more of a different topic. This is mostly focused on the eternal society paradox.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's time that we talk about your like epistemology because I remember we're talking things about like intuitions and things like that, and I don't think we really got deep into what do you mean by intuitions, because I was telling you like intuitions to me is like feelings, what things feel to us, right? And I want to get a little bit more.
Maybe it's best to give examples of what I mean by intuition. The definition of intuition, again, in the philosophical sense of the term, is what the consciousness immediately apprehends and what is directly present to one's consciousness. So an example would be the way we mentally see that 1 + 1 = 2, or the intuition that our memory is at least sometimes reliable, the intuition that our sensory experiences are at least somewhat reliable, that they have some connection to a world external to our minds, the intuition that the external world is real. So those are examples of what I mean by intuition. Now, could you call it a feeling? Well, do you feel that 1 + 1 = 2? I mean, maybe you could call it a feeling, but I'm not sure if that really fits in the ordinary sense of the word feeling. It's just something that we intuit, and that's why I think intuition is just really a better catch-all word for this sort of experience.
Gotcha. But and I think I was telling you this before, I see dangers with intuition, right?
Right. Now, I'm not saying that all intuition is created equal. That is not my position. Some intuitions are better than others. Like my intuition that 1 + 1 = 2, for example. I have greater confidence in that intuition than say that my intuition the external world is real, for example. And I have this intuition that the external world is real. I think that's more trustworthy than, say, if I had a hunch that it's going to rain tomorrow. And so not all intuitions are created equal, certainly. We do have to be cautious about that.
Gotcha. So I want like a hierarchy of values or a hierarchy of intuitions, I guess. Like I was asking you for your method for getting truth, like your epistemology. And to say intuitions is not very satisfying because it's just like, well, my mind feels this way. And I need more precision.
So I guess one of my key intuitions is what we sometimes called rational intuitions, the deliverances of reason with respect to a priori beliefs, like 1 + 1 = 2. There are no married bachelors. So the core mathematics stuff that I think that's like at the top. Or another example, I exist. That's an intuition I have, and it's very difficult to kind of disagree with that. I think for me, so that's an intuition I have. So a little bit lower than that, we have things like, my memory is at least sometimes reliable. There's an external world. My sense experience is at least somewhat reliable. And then roughly around there, at that same level of sense experience being at less somewhat reliable, is the certain moral experiences I have. Like, it's morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun. That seems, yeah, about as, on the same level. I think that, that the external world is real, my intuition, because they're both based on experience. And then further out, we have things like testimony. That testimony is the testimony that I can't verify for myself is reliable. For example, I believe there is such a thing as Japan. Have I ever been to Japan? No. I just basically been taking everybody's word for it that Japan exists and that these photographs haven't been doctored or anything like that. And that, that what's in my science textbook is reliable because, even if these experiments haven't been done, I haven't done them myself. So, and then we get to testimony, and then we kind of branch out further than that. So that's kind of a rough review about my epistemology.
Gotcha. I wanted like a little bit more basic epistemology. Like, for example, like I can build, I guess you could say more complicated epistemology, like a method for finding truth is usually like pay attention at incentives, right? Like if a used car salesman that owns a car lot is selling you a car, he's probably not trustworthy because his incentives are to sell you that car. He probably won't tell you all the defects the car has or something like that, right? So that's an example of like an epistemology, but that's like really, really high up. I want something more fundamental. Like how do we even get there, right? These are more facts of like psychology. I'll give you my epistemology. I think I already gave it before, but like I'm looking for consistency, so like no contradictions. I'm looking for parsimony. I'm trying to have like limited assumptions. You could also call that like Occam's razor. And then I'm looking for empiricism. And for me, that's like the most important one. Like that grounds even rationality for me. Empiricism is, and like when I say empiricism, that's built on like the same intuitions you have. Like there's a world out there and there's a world in here, right? Like I have sensory experience, right? But then I also have my imagination. And in my imagination does not match my sensory experience. So that's how I build up my intuition that there's a world out there and a world in here, right? Like I can imagine that there's like a 700-pound gorilla in my room right now. I can imagine that, but I don't see that and I don't experience that. So that's how like that intuition is born, just by how I am, by my ontology. So based on how I am. That's why I have this intuition. There's a world out there and a world in here. And then how do I know when something is really out there? And for me, it's the senses, empiricism, because my imagination is not necessarily the same as the world out there.
Yeah, I think we can find common ground there because I gave just like, examples of why I believe I do, like intuition. But there's also other intuition that interacts with the empirical world for me. Like, for example, I think that all else held constant, simpler theories are more likely to be true. I believe that the future will relevantly resemble the past. And of course, because of rational intuition, I believe that, certain rules of probability apply and so forth. And so we can talk about epistemology like, after this, because we've kind of already discussed it before. I kind of want to stick to this particular discussion for what we've already discussed. But that's all we've already discussed the eternal society paradox. That's all you had to say about that, right?
Yeah, just one more question about epistemology before we move on. If your reason does not match your senses, what do you change? So let's just say
it depends on what the reason and the senses are. Like, for example, there are optical illusions. And if I have rational reason to believe that my senses are fooling me, that it's an illusion, then I would trust reasons in conjunction with that. So there's all sorts of optical illusions out there, and we can like verify. It's like, okay, my senses really are fooling me.
Okay, one question: how do you know if it's actually an optical illusion?
Well, you kind of use like reason and logic in conjunction with prior experiences.
And that's what I'm saying. Like the only time you trump your senses, it seems like it's when you use your senses again. Right, and you could do it very indirectly. Like I was telling you this before, and I think it might sound a little crazy, but like I think the law of non-contradiction is secured by the senses because that's how we experience the world. The principle of parsimony or Occam's razor, that's how you experience the world. If you just make assumptions, you end up making a lot of mistakes. That's how we experience it.
So I disagree with why you tried this ground before. Now, if you want to talk epistemology outside this episode of discussion, we could do that after that. But as far as the eternal society paradox, That's all you had to say, right?
On that paradox, yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess that'll do it for this particular discussion. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.